This 1805 fantasy was one of Chopin's favorite pieces to play and teach, and it only takes a few measures to hear why. The composer of this singing phrase, Johann Nepomuk Hummel, had spent 2 years of his childhood living and studying with Mozart in the 1780s. 2 decades later, he was expanding on Mozart's models with a new, highly ornate style of melodic pianism. The left hand in a lot of Hummel's piano music was like a neutral orchestral backdrop, only there to outline the basic harmonies. It was the right hand that, like a coloratura singer, got to show off all of its agility and range. Take an extreme example from the end of this movement, when Hummel simply refused to end the phrase that began at the top of the page. In the musical language of the period, this 6/4 chord was the universal signal for this statement is about to end. Unless it appeared just before a concerto cadenza, this chord would typically resolve within the next measure or two. But Hummel had other plans. While the left hand chugs away at its steady accompaniment, the right hand spins rapid scales up the entire keyboard, passing through remote keys before hovering around the dominant in an elaborately chromatic cadenza and extravagantly long trill. Hummel's virtuosity here is highly pianistic, pushing beyond the bounds of what is possible to literally sing. Still, in many ways, his music resembles a specific type of singing, the Florid melodies famously associated with the Italian bel canto operas of Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini. This flowering burst of melody is an example of fioriture, a kind of sung ornament that was hugely popular in the first few decades of the century. An 1840s treatise on the art of singing by the baritone and influential pedagogue Manuel García the Younger describes how these runs were crafted. Broadly, vocalizations could be slurred, smooth, marked, detached, or aspirated. For example, by slurring, singers could expressively slide from one note to another. Hummel did not have these microtonal inflections available to him on the piano. Technically, he couldn't even do a proper smooth legato, but he could at least imitate these techniques with delicate articulation and pedal. such as here where the main notes are visually distinguished from the smaller, gliding ones. Chopin did something similar with a sighing chromatic effect in his F-sharp major nocturne. It was custom for singers to devise their own melodic ornaments, described by Garcia here. These included turns with small, rapid flurries of notes, scales, repeated notes, arpeggiated chords, accented appoggiaturas, and trills, each of which came with its own set of variants for endless possibilities. These kinds of runs and ornaments are found all over the place in Hummel's piano music. When done properly, ornaments lend greater interest to repeated ideas, but Garcia warned that they had to be appropriate for the character and the text. To illustrate, he wrote out a much too florid version of Count Almaviva's cavatina from The Barber of Seville on this top staff, which he says would be too languid and grandiose for the brilliant Count.
Sorgi mia dolce speme, vieni bell'idol mio.
Once again, Hummel helps illustrate this cautionary point in his piano music. The slow movement from his sixth piano sonata ends with what has to be the most elaborate possible variation on this simple opening theme. We find that same basic left-hand accompaniment with detached, asymmetrically grouped embellishments in the right hand. While it's definitely over the top, it is an interesting experiment in extreme ornamentation. There was much more to bel canto singing than just embellishment. In his treatise, Garcia advocated for rubato, where the accompaniment remains in time while the voice gets rhythmic liberty, slowing down and speeding up proportionally in a way that doesn't change the total duration of the phrase. This is consistent with how Hummel, Chopin, and so many other pianists taught rubato to their own students. Nowhere else does the vocal line enjoy more liberty from the accompaniment than in cadences at the ends of phrases or stanzas, which Garcia notated in dozens of richly ornamented examples. piano music around the turn of the 19th century shared many characteristics with these florid vocal cadenzas. From the 1790s onward, these gestures began to acquire more weight and embellishment in slow movements to achieve more emphatic closing phrases, even at the cost of symmetry. For example, the cantabile variation from Mozart's 1775 Dönitz sonata retains the original theme's phrase structure despite its highly ornate texture. Even after all of this florid melodic writing, Mozart was content to end with a quaint, two-beat cadential trill. But we find a more elaborate cadence in Clementi's Opus 33 No. 3 Sonata of 1794, originally a piano concerto, which enlarges its final cadence for dramatic effect. First, listen to how the right-hand melody becomes increasingly florid in its first appearance. Clementi heightens the return of this theme at the end of the movement with increasingly excited runs that lead to that same cadential 6/4 chord, only this time it's tripled in duration, 6 beats instead of 2, with metrically displaced groupings in thirds and ascending chromatic scales that wind up more tension before the final cadential trill. Clementi's carefully planned melodic elaboration makes this otherwise basic theme earn its final cadence at the movement's close. 13 years later, the Czech virtuoso Jan Ladislav Dussek ornamented a cadence in an even grander and more novel way. In the middle of the second movement of his Return to Paris sonata, Dussek introduces the cadential 6/4 chord that signals the end of the phrase and the return to the main theme. The signposting is almost too obvious. The harmony lingers for 3 measures with that basic pulse in the left hand as the right soars through the B major scale, finally landing on that classic cadential trill. But then, something unusual happens. The trill dissolves over a surprise change in harmony, and suddenly we find ourselves in a circle of fifths progression while this expressive melody spins out above it. This finally takes us on a roundabout path back to the main theme. As opposed to vocal cadenzas, the benefit of pianistic ones is that the performer never runs out of breath. We can again look to Hummel's piano music to find the post-classical cadence in its most elaborate form. His sonata in F-sharp minor, composed 2 years after Beethoven's Hammerklavier, has an especially florid slow movement with a cadence that takes its sweet time in resolving through a sequence of high-flying events. The right hand mounts a series of rising broken thirds and sixths, spins out at the top of its arc, and then goes for more trills strung together by gliding scales and arpeggios, and then a quiet closing phrase releases all of the tension. Nowadays, there are 3 early 19th century composers who get the most recognition for adapting these florid vocal styles into their piano music: Chopin, Hummel, and John Field. Field notably developed the piano nocturne in the 1810s, a lyrical genre characterized by a moderate tempo, broken chord accompaniments in the left hand, and ornate song-like melodies in the right. His pioneering examples were precursors to and early models for Chopin's nocturnes. But Hummel and Field weren't the only composers writing vocal-inspired piano works with these characteristic embellished figures before Chopin's time. For example, this sonata movement by Ferdinand Ries, a Beethoven pupil, has these fleeting bursts of melody in the right hand over an arpeggiated accompaniment that suggests the emergence of the nocturne is not far off. There's also this expressive moment from an 1810 sonata by Kuhlau that hints of the later impassioned outbursts of Chopin. Two years after that piece, Dussek's Invocation Sonata, his final work, featured some embellished lyrical episodes that might strike the modern listener as vaguely Chopinesque. of my favorite rare discoveries in this vein is this slow movement from an 1820s piano sonata by Heinrich Marschner, a notable German opera composer. Marschner's sonatas are generally more post-classical than proto-romantic, but you can also hear some shared characteristics with the sonatas of Schubert, Weber, and Mendelssohn. This passage from his third sonata is clearly a take on the virtuosic roulades of bel canto singing. Just like in any era of music, these kinds of materials were commonly dispersed, adapted, and reinterpreted by countless composers, with some of it being intentional borrowing, while much of it was just the reality of sharing the same sound world. What's so fascinating is that despite their textures looking similar on paper, the musical results of these different pieces varied drastically. Conspicuously absent from the discussion so far is Beethoven, who tended to avoid this kind of surface-level embellishment in his piano writing. There were exceptions, such as his earlier sonatas and his variations, a genre that called for ornament by definition. But what are we to make of this unusually long-winded slow movement from Beethoven's 16th sonata? For pianists like Alfred Brendel and Andras Schiff, this was Beethoven's idea of a joke.
The second movement is, according to Alfred Brendel, and I couldn't agree with him more, is a parody of Italian opera. A movement which is totally uncharacteristic of himself, because it is not economical, it's incredibly long, everything is too much, everything is too much ornamented. And these cadenzas, they are show-off cadenzas. And Beethoven is really not a show. So this is trying to make fun of his contemporaries who are trying to make a cheap effect.
There is evidence that Beethoven generally disliked unnecessary embellishments. When his student Carl Czerny once performed Beethoven's Opus 16 Wind Quintet with newly added ornaments, Beethoven publicly chewed him out, badly enough to send an apology note soon after, saying that he simply wanted to hear the score exactly as he wrote it, no matter how beautifully Czerny might have played. As a composer, Czerny was evidently more willing than his teacher to indulge in florid maximalism. The slow movement of his 10th piano sonata from 1831 is a special case in point. Its hyper-embellished textures, unusual even by Czerny's standards, suggests that it could have been a competitive response to something external, like the newly emerging virtuosity of Chopin and Liszt. This music effectively summarizes the florid pianism we've discussed so far. Pages blackened with dense bar lines, relatively basic left-hand accompaniment with swirling stratospheric right-hand melodies in thirds, arpeggios, trills, and of course that long-winded cadential trill that squeezes out every last drop of expression. It may seem strange that pianists have long embraced this idea of singing on the piano, when it's one of the least suited instruments for imitating the human voice. It cannot add vibrato or swell on a single note. It only connects notes through the illusion of finger or pedal legato. It cannot bend or slur pitches. Plus, the sound decay of early 19th century forte pianos was much quicker than those of modern instruments. But florid ornaments similar to those found in bel canto opera allowed the pianist to better achieve that illusion of a sustained singing tone, to swell over a drawn-out trill, to glide between registers, to float a melody above its accompaniment as if the right hand were a vocalist and the left an orchestra. That doesn't mean every pianistic flourish was necessarily consciously imitative of singing. These composers were also pushing the boundaries of keyboard technique for its own sake, and much of what they wrote is pianistic in ways that no voice could replicate. But the bel canto model remains one of the most powerful lenses we have for understanding what this music was trying to do expressively. In lessons, pianists are often told to be things they are not. Play that dotted rhythm like a trumpet. Weave in that lower voice like a cello. The staccato bass should sound like timpani, and so on. Some of the most expressive moments in piano music happen when we aspire to be more like singers, so we can forgive the delusion if the results sing for themselves.